Hi, everybody, and welcome. We're excited to share this recorded presentation, which has evolved over the last few months with some of your fellows. And we've had some really rich conversations. And as a result of those conversations and the fact that a lot of folks weren't able to join at the right times and be able to see it all together, we've decided to make this recording so everyone can take a look and really kind of experience what we'd like to do with introducing Pando in a new way. And what we're trying to do with this session, and perhaps a number of sessions, depending on how you want to view the video, if you want to break it up, stretch in between, or possibly see them as pieces over the course of even a few days or weeks, is to introduce the idea of a purposeful Pando. So when we think about Pando, we think about sort of the sizzle, the flying pieces, the dots and the connections, and we get excited about seeing our movement visualized. And that is really exciting, and it changes the way that we think about who we are, where we sit, and the potential of this movement. But at the same time, very quickly, we sort of come to the question, well, so what, and what do we do next? So with this presentation, what we're trying to do is introduce a perspective for this particular conversation around what it would mean to use Pando to increase your sphere of influence. And what we mean by that is to think about you as a fellow, as a leader in the movement, and think about what you might do with the support of Pando data and the Pando ecosystem's relationship mapping platform to think through how you can increase your influence, how you can be focused on smart partnerships that will increase your potential to really shift power both at the local level and also internationally. So this is really for you. It's for you as an individual, as a professional, and it's really for you as a leader in your organization. So I think those two things are really important to keep in mind. So for the conversation, we're going to look at a few things. One is to back up and tell the story about the Pando platform, which was this particular map we call the Pathways to Power map. And we'll take a quick look at the numbers. So who's in it? Who's mapped? What's the ratio of international organizations to local, and what it kind of looks like at a high level. We're also going to unpack and explain three really important metrics in Pando, which you've probably seen, but maybe you just need to stop the train and really focus in on a little bit more. And so we're going to explore three kind of roles, and we call them either roles of folks or organizations or individuals in maps, or we could think about them as functions as well. But in a map, we have resource hubs, we have folks that are subject matter experts, we have the organizations or individuals that make connections across the system of actors, and we have network as folks that are really active in reaching out. And there are other kinds of actors in systems, but those are three important ones that we will explore together. And then the really main piece of this will be to dig into 5 tips for expanding your organization and you as an individual, your sphere of influence, your ability to reach across the shift to power community and influence the conversation, contribute to the conversation, and build coalitions to support the movement. And in all of this, we're going to pause and explore how Pando and a little bit of a dive into the map itself can support us in the exploration of fulfilling those tips, of bringing alive the actions that we recommend in the 5 tips. Before I move on to the pathways to power sort of details and what's in it, just wanted to share quickly the history of the map. This starts, I think it's 2015, 2016, when we were in Joburg together for what was really a momentous event. It was the Shift to Power hashtag launch. It was 200 plus folks in Joburg at a conference that was convened by the Global Fund for Community Foundations. And this is really where a lot of pieces began to come together. It was percolating, of course, before that, but the hashtag essence of this really comes back to Joburg. And one of the things that we supported at the time was the idea that maybe we were doing early mapping at that time in 2016. We had mapped a number of different communities using the Pando platform. And we thought, why don't we do a live mapping? And during the couple days of the conference, we would get up and actually, I remember on the first day of the conference in the morning, we got up and introduced the Pando platform. We projected a screen on the conference stage and opened up the platform, and we said, get in it. Here's a sign in, log in, and give us your relationships. And we watched on the screen in real time as the relationships began to form. We saw dots with arrows. We saw Global Fund, of course, in the center, and this sort of bicycle wheel emerge, a spider eventually emerging. And we saw in real time in about 15 minutes how the community was looking. And then we came back 24 hours later, the second day, and looked at it again after people had a chance to pause and more thoughtfully map their relationships, and got this first snapshot of the community. And from that time, it's slowly grown. We've had a number of different events, webinars, we've had some focus groups, we've had folks come in and learn more about the importance of visualizing our system, what's been invisible more visible, and the power of that. We've written some blog posts about what it means, what we're seeing in the map. And then in 2018, we had a event again hosted by Global Fund. This is when the manifesto was launched. It's in London, and again we had an opportunity to bring back the Pathways to Power map and get a second collection. So there's two big pieces of this. There's the Joburg launch, where we gather lots of data. There's the in-between pieces where we get some fill in some of those small pieces, the small stones, and then this big event in London. And then of course we have the fellows, and the fellows represents in many ways the third big sort of I'm going to say leg of the three-legged stool. In order for us to really collect the data that's really important, this is our moment to really bring it together and really collect the data that matters the most. So I'll reinforce that by just showing you a little bit about who we have represented in the map right now. And at a high level, we have just under 600 organizations that are represented in the Pathways to Power map. So these are our colleagues, international and local, that are committed to the movement and self-identify as being part of the Pathways to Power, the Shift to Power movement. We have about 1,200 relationships. What does that mean? It means that people have identified connections and conversations, around 1,200 of them, that are specific to Pathways to Power, Shift to Power concerns. And I believe there are 11, is that right, Angela? 11 collaboration areas, and we'll talk about them in just a second and go over those. So that 1,200 relationships are divided among these 11 different collaboration areas. We also can say that there are 103 organizations that have mapped. What does it mean to map? It means getting a login. It means signing in with your own login credentials. So you're representing your organization. You might be a consultant, so you can be an individual as well. And you're asked to go through, and you land on a relationships page. You identify who you go to meet your needs across potentially 11 different Shift the Power concern areas. We call them collaboration areas. And then we get you to nudge over, you wiggle over to another page, and you spend just a few minutes filling in some of the details of your organizational profile or your personal profile. And so we hear about whether you're local, whether or not you're focused on particular areas of expertise, and that kind of thing. So those are the pieces. That's what it means to have mapped. So what you can see here is when we have only 100 or so organizations that have mapped, we still have extraordinary discovery because each of you, when you map, are identifying power players that you go to that are critical in your own little bubble, your ecosystem, your personal ecosystem. We're going to call that a sphere of influence actually for today. And so we have in total quite a few organizations, around 600, that have been identified, not all of which we have details about, but we certainly know a little bit about how they fit into our pathways of power ecosystem. And then finally, we have a little bit of data around whether or not the organizations represented in the map are local or if they're international. And as you can see from the beginning, we've had overrepresentation from international organizations. In many ways, the Pathways to Power launch in Joburg was from the beginning dominated by key actors in the international side. And as we looked at the data early on, and this has been true all the way till today, there is a preferential attachment to international organizations that still exists in our Shift the Power movement. And this is one of the reasons that the Fellows program is so important, to build ambassadors, to build voices from the Global South that can represent the Shift the Power movement, or that more authentically than international organizations that mean well, read change included, but are not authentic to the space. So I'm going to move on and share a little bit more about the, oh dear, it's 12 areas of collaboration. So you can see here, I've got the 12 most popular collaboration areas listed from most popular to less popular. What that means is the number of relationships that are counted and the engagement. So if I say that I go to Claudia to solve my needs around positive narratives, that would indicate a certain level of interest. If another 100 people do that, then that would actually indicate that it's a very, very popular area. So we're counting essentially sort of need-seeking moments, the seekers exploring these areas. And the most seeking that we have in the Pathways to Power map is around community philanthropy, funding practices to shift power, and local ownership. And you can see as we look down, it becomes less popular, and we learn a little bit actually just with a quick peek around where our emphasis is, which is great. That's where our energy is and our conversations are predominant. But we're also seeing areas that are bubbling up and perhaps undernourished and under-attended to, for example, self-care and solidarity. And there are a number of groups that are part of the Shift the Power movement that are really trying to elevate this up, for example. So that's a little bit where we are on the 12 collaboration areas. We're going to spend a couple minutes talking about, as I mentioned before, some of the key metrics and the key roles or players in the map, which are really important for us to understand in order to really tap in and leverage the Pando map. So the first role I wanted to reintroduce for probably a lot of you is the idea of a resource hub. So to do that, I'd like you to just, if you can, grab a piece of paper and an old-fashioned pen, and just think for a minute about your own family. So probably you've got probably a good-sized family, and I want you to think about who it might be in your family that is just sort of really renowned, like really knows everyone about everything about everyone actually in your family. And I'm thinking about the extended family. So your mother's side, father's side, really richly knows everything about everyone. And it might be an aunt, it could be an uncle, it could be your mother, it might even be you. It's often an aunt, sometimes a rare uncle, I've found when I ask this question. But as you think about that, and take a look at what you've written down and just even say it out loud, the name of your relative. This is sort of your superhero, your sort of representative for what we mean by a resource hub. And in a Shift the Power community, what this means is that this is someone that is identified by the Shift the Power community as being really, we're going to say, a subject matter expert, on this topic. And in the case of your family, it's the subject matter expertise is everyone in your family, what they're doing, how they're doing, what's their health like, how is their work going, what are their concerns, what's their mood like, all of those pieces. And in the case of the Shift the Power movement, It's going to be around expertise around one of the 12 collaboration areas, or just the movement as a general whole, the vibe of it. So that is what we call the resource hub. The next role that I wanted to reintroduce is what we often refer to as the broker. But in many cultures, the broker has a negative connotation. So we can think about the broker also as an ambassador. And this is now again, if we had to think about your family, someone who is able to connect up disparate sides of your family. So the easiest way to think about this might be to think about your mother's family, your father's family, and who in your family, either side, is able to really kind of make the introductions and really is the glue between your mother and father's side of the families. That's a brokering role, that's an ambassador role. And in the Shift the Power movement, these would be folks that are able to make connections between, let's say, the centralized actors that are perhaps longest standing and most active and most visible in the Shift the Power movement, and perhaps some of the folks on the edges that are newer to the movement, don't necessarily know what it means, but have been doing it naturally and living it in their own community spaces. It could be folks that make connections, are really good at connections between international organizations and local organizations. For example, a Root Change tries to focus on those bridging and ambassadorial roles. It could be also that you're bridging between, let's say, funding and philanthropy, or you're bridging between measuring what matters the most, metrics and MEL, and community mobilization or community development. So it's folks that can bring these different communities of practice, and even sort of different types of actors in organizations together. And then finally, I want us to think about the networker. And so again, grab a pen and quickly write down who in your family is that person who is always on the phone, always calling, always engaging, always reaching out. And if you can think of someone, write down that name. And again, this is our superhero for the networker. Your family member's name that you just wrote down is has this habit. It's like part of their DNA to just always be reaching out. It's not an accident. It's just their mode of operation. And the active networker in our Shift the Power community is going to be the organization or the individual that just has the same habit, is always reaching out, is always engaging. And it's an interesting dynamic because there are folks who really, they're nurturers. They have a few core groups that they connect with, just like us in real life. You know, some of us love to nurture our small group of friends. Others of us are always out there, always demonstrating like on a broader scale and, you know, externally engaging. And that's what the networker, the active networker, is all about. So why do these roles matter so much? When we think about our ecosystem, the Resource Hub is a peer-validated subject matter expert. And so when we want to know who's in the system that really represents knowledge, is a trusted messenger, a trusted knowledge expert, one way to see that is through the metrics of the Resource Hub. And we know that Pando can show us that. We also are always interested in knowing who can help us stitch together, weave together in a more cohesive way the Shift the Power community. That's our ambassador and broker. And then the active network is the lifeblood of relationships. So if we don't have folks that are reaching out, then we don't have a map, we don't have a system. We also know that you can be a prominent resource hub and not be an active networker. And similarly, you can be an active networker and not be an active resource hub, and not be identified as a resource hub. So there are many ways to think about this. This is just a little quick introduction to our core metrics and rules that are going to help us as we move forward. And then the last thing I'm going to share before we take a little stretch is a look at these three roles or metrics in relation to the data we have for the Pathways to Power map. And so in the area of resource hubs, and you can again think about your family member as to unpack and explore what this means, resource hub. We have, perhaps not at all surprisingly, the Global Fund for Community Foundations. Civicus and Alliance Magazine is identified as being go-to places for resources information at the highest level. So this is across all the collaborations, all 12 aggregated together. And that makes sense. These are our high-level global resources. The Global Fund has an extraordinary role in playing a founding role in this movement in terms of the hashtag launch and being the convening space as it's emerged naturally. But we also get some really interesting discoveries here in 4th and 5th position, and then in 5th position, we have the Zambian Governance Foundation, we have KCDF, and we have the Africa Philanthropy Network, APN. So we are seeing actually some really positive change over time, where resource hubs are no longer just focused in on international organizations. For example, Mott Foundation was originally quite prominently seen in the resource hub position, and now we're seeing a wide variety of actors that have been really active in the movement. So CGF, KCDF, APN, WACC, we're seeing Adesso rise also as a peer-validated expert and voice from the community. Of course, Bond and others are here as well. And then moving over to the role of ambassador and broker, there's some overlap, and it's interesting to look across the three columns to see where there's overlap and where there's actually differences. We are seeing again an APN, a global fund, a ZGF, but we're also seeing some other groups as well. Mott Foundation is still playing a brokering role. Root change is up here, I think, largely because we're so prominent in the mapping exercise. I think, quite honestly, we're elevated here. It's certainly a role we aspire to have. I think we're overrepresented. We see, Indiana University, I think we see in an organization, we sometimes see a strong leader who's filling gaps. So we might see an organizational name, but there's something behind that. And in this particular case, it's about a very active and strong leader and thought leader. Philanthropy for Social Justice and Peace is up here. Wildegensen is up here, probably largely because of collaboration on the Giving for Change work with Global Fund. So interesting to sort of look at that. These are ever changing. The more we come back and map again, the more we get in terms of changing data. And what makes this interesting is that it should be volatile. It should be changing. What you do in the system should matter, and we should see ever-changing groups here in the top 10. And finally, we can take a look at the active networkers. Here we see very different behaviors. Folks that are active may or may not be brokers and resource hubs. Humanity United, Empower, KCDF makes a show again. In general, we love seeing groups across all three. If you're in all top 10 of all three, you're doing really well. You've broken the mold of being able to be both a powerful networker, which is not necessarily, as I said earlier, something that comes with being a resource hub, and to be in both of those roles. And then ultimately to play a networking role is sort of the holy grail. Right now, I think we see Global Fund, GFCF, as really being the only trifecta. KCDF also, I believe, is KCDF on there? Maybe not. KCDF is not on our brokerage role. We do see some interesting players across all three. We would love to see, what is our goal here over the longer term, is to see local organizations represented in the top 10 predominantly, and to see that there are some folks that are really taking leadership roles. I know that Global Fund and Jenny's almost raison d'etre when they wake up in the morning is to make sure that the Global Fund is no longer number one on any of these three columns. So let's take a little stretch and pause. And when we come back, we're going to take a look at these 5 tips that are going to help us think about expanding our sphere of influence. Okay, let's take a look at the 5 tips that we have that we're hoping to share with you for expanding your organization's sphere of influence. So again, what we're talking about is some concrete things you could try in order to expand your influence, expand your reach across the Shift the Power community. And the 5 tips in terms of high level that we're going to discuss include, number 1, building your own Shift the Power personal board. And what we mean by that is exploring what it would look like if you had an informal group together that could support you and build up your own core brand as a key leader in the movement. The second tip we'll talk about is using Pando to meet a champion networker and exploring their networking behaviors and patterns and beginning to emulate some of those patterns. So learning from the best, essentially. The third tip is about choosing a community of practice, a learning community, a group focused on the concerns and issues that you care most about, and actually entering that space either anew or perhaps amplifying and reinforcing your presence in that space and making a real splash, making a presence in that community practice. The fourth tip is actually both the fourth and fifth tips come from some research that Root Change did several years ago with support from the Federation of the Red Cross, the American Red Cross, and a private foundation. And in that work, we were funded to explore what were the drivers of high performance for civil society. And in looking at this community, it was a 22-country study. We actually used a lot of qualitative methodologies that included a peer review. We had about 50 peer researchers from the 22 countries that were able to interview and engage with one another. So, for example, a Zambian civil society member was part of the team. They were able to go to Canada and interview folks in Canada about some of their civil society organizations and performance issues and drivers. And similarly, that counterpart went to Zambia and did the same thing with Zambian civil society organizations. This was a 2-year study. And in the study, a couple of things emerged that really give us the focus on tips 4 and 5. The first thing that we learned, unrelated to any kind of relationship, is that if you are a civil society organization in a low income country and it is a low Human Development Index or HDI score, so this HDI measurement has been around for over 25 years, I believe. We see it every year. So what we saw is that your scores on the surveys and instruments to measure the drivers of performance were lower in low HDI countries, and they were higher in high HD countries. So included in the study were a mix of low, medium, and high income countries. There's all sorts of issues around some of the instrumentation. So instrumentation bias aside, there was a strong correlation between a low score on these instruments and your HDI, your low HDI score. And so this first sort of takeaway is really depressing. It sort of suggests that there's a destiny attached to your country's HDI score. So if you're in a medium HDI country, you're going to be okay. If you're in a high HDI, you're going to be great. And if you're stuck in a low income country with a low HDI score, you're carrying this sort of baggage, this albatross that is difficult to escape. Now, if we assume that data is correct, and to some extent it probably is, and to some extent it may be overstated, but there's no question that the context around us are burdens. And so whether it be people living in poverty that don't have extended family to support them, or organizations living their work out in low-income environments and low-resource environments, there are impacts. And this is what we saw through the study. But that was an accident finding. What we were really exploring was what were the drivers of high-performing organizations. And what we found that was unique is that when organizations had a variety of connections, a certain smart networking pattern, they were able to outperform their peer colleague organizations in their country. So if you were in a low HDI country like Malawi, for example, and you had a certain kind of set of relationships and networks, connections across the system, you were scoring at the level of a medium HDI or even a high HDI country. So the data here, this is actually where we first introduced some of our most early work on network analysis. And this was actually kind of astounding to us. What we discovered is your ticket out of your low HDI environment is actually through networking. And the organizations that were able to outperform their HDI baggage had 2 or 3 really unique patterns. So the first one was that they had connections to international organizations, and they were critical, but they were strategic, and they were few. So 3 to 4 connections to international organizations with reciprocal relationships. So I go to you, let's say in the Netherlands, and yes, you come to me. So that was a key dimension of the networking pattern that allow you to outperform your low HDI baggage. And what's interesting about this is it wasn't the groups that had 15 international connections and only that. That wasn't, it turns out, the ticket out. The ticket out was having 3 to 4 strategic relationships that were reciprocal. And so that's tip number 2. And then tip number 5 also grows from this study. And that is to deepen and expand your connections with local partners, because the groups that were able to also outperform their low HDI or medium HDI colleagues and outperform high HDI CSOs in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Canada, in the United States, they had intense ties at the local level. And they had one other thing. They had unique and exclusive ties with local actors that very few others had. So a combination of having 3 to 4 strategic ties internationally and having intense ties with local actors and some exclusive ties with different kinds of actors really elevated up their power and importance. And when you had these 3 things, you were able to outperform your HDI destiny. So that is where tips number 4 and 5 come from. And we're going to launch now into tip number 1. So this is something that you really actually have complete control over. It's you as an individual, and it's about you as a leader in the movement. So many of you are already connected to the movement. You are learning from each other. You're in a way, as a fellow, you are in effect building a circle of friends, hopefully lasting relationships, and trusted advisors. And actually, that's the idea around tip number 1. It's to think about who intentionally you would want to be sitting on your side. And in our lives, we often have, informal advisors that play really critical roles in our lives. We don't name them. They're not sitting on a board. We don't have board meetings or committee meetings, but we call them when we need them. And they might be people that bring perspective when you're working too hard and get you, kick back and do better quality of life and exercise and just good thinking, self-care. They could be folks that, are actually there, to advise you around finances. You may be negligent. You might not be thinking about that every day as a passionate change agent, but there might be someone that actually you turn to once in a while and say, man, what should I be doing here? Should I be thinking more carefully about the way I'm managing my finances? My family matter too. Help me think about that. So we have advisors in all these sort of, personal ways. Some people help us with our careers that we go to. We may not see them that often, but once in a while we reach out and we need them to support our next stage. I'm getting itchy. I'm ready for something new. Now I might go to that advisor that helps me with my career. So what we're proposing here is that you all think about who would you want on your own personal board, informal, to support you in being everything you can be in the Shift the Power movement. And it could be that you already have a deep knowledge of a particular space, but actually there are certain, let's say, missing pieces, white spaces, holes in kind of you as a full leader of the movement. And we think that it's important for you to think about who you might want to have by your side. And so ways to think about that. First, who do you already know inside the Shift the Power community that could fill potentially one of these roles? When we were working with some of your colleague fellows, things came up like measuring what matters. I really would love to learn more about what that's like. Other people identified self-care roles, or identified community philanthropy roles, or identified financing roles. So those things, that you would sort of like to just round out. And there might be people you already know in the community that can support that. The next thing we'd love you to think about is to explore whether or not these individuals or organizations, as representatives of individuals, have actually mapped in Pando. And if so, how are they positioned as resource hubs, networkers, and or as ambassadors or brokers? So that's back to those key roles. And so what is it about those folks? Could they really, let's explore whether or not Claudia, for example, who might be a real wonderful advisor for me on appreciative approaches to community development, is actually seen as a resource hub by the community. Is she peer validated? Is she actively networking? Is she playing a brokering role? Let me see where she fits into this space. And then based on your scan of the map, of the Pathways to the Power map, we might also explore folks that you don't actually know yet. So we could take a look at who's sitting in those systems and who you might make a connection out to. How would you make a connection? Well, let's explore that together on Pando. So I'm going to switch gears for a moment and jump over to Pando. And this is actually on this video, the first time we're looking at Pando. All of you have seen it before. We remember that there are about 600 organizations identified here. The nodes each represent an organization, and the arrows and the lines represent one of those 1,200 or so relationships that I talked about earlier in this conversation. The width of the lines, which is sometimes hard to see, also represents the intensity of ties. And the color of the dots right now, what do they indicate? They tell us about the nature of the relationships and who in the map is hanging out with who. So for example, the green guys are hanging out here. There's some amber guys hanging out. It's kind of a red gang that likes to connect. And that usually tells us a little bit about, it could be language affinity. It could be, these are the French speakers. These are the Portuguese speakers. These are the Spanish speakers. It could be geography. These are the Southern African organizations. It could be topical. These are the folks that love talking about community philanthropy. These are the folks that, love talking about funding practices. So that's what that tells us a little bit about. It also, interestingly, could indicate funding patterns. So sometimes we see these colored dots and we say, aha, it looks like a funder has moved here. These are the Mott organizations. Everyone here has been funded by Mott, and therefore that honeypot of the Mott money brought people together, and it sticks. So our relationships are often driven by ideas, resources, and money. So let's take a look now at this issue of using Pando to think a little bit, help me think about my personal board. So let me ask Claudia first. Claudia, on your Shift the Power personal board, in terms of the roles you have and don't have, who is someone, what role would you like to fill if you were to move forward with this tip and try to begin to build a personal board for supporting you on Shift the Power movement.
Evan, I would really love to dive deeper into community giving models.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to find someone on my personal board who can help me understand what approaches are working best to kind of build a culture of philanthropy, and more importantly, to get community engaged and in the driver's seat around making decisions about what's best for a community and what deserves to be funded. That would be
Okay.
really helpful to me.
Cool. Awesome. So, so the first thing I think I'd recommend that we do with Pando is go over here on the left side and look at the filter by collaboration area. This is where we're going to see the 12 collaboration areas that we highlighted earlier in the conversation. And they're in a little scroll here. You can kind of see them all. There are, as we said, 12. So there's a lot of coverage here. Fortunately, Claudia's interests can probably are captured here in one of the collaboration areas, probably best identified as community philanthropy, I would say, and possibly in addition, maybe local ownership.
Yeah.
And let's see what else might possibly fit. Really, this one would, I think, it's a pretty good fit. So we're going to click on community philanthropy. And as you can see, the map just filtered for the relationships and organizations that are specific to that collaboration area. So what was once all highlighted, these organizations that are now gray are not part of the community philanthropy right now, community collaboration area. And we're seeing a different kind of a style of map. We're seeing quite a bit of activity down here. Remember, our colors indicate who's hanging out with who. Still a little hard to figure this out. So I'm going to go up here to the right and click on Show Metric Table. And what that does is give me the names of the organizations in the map so we can see them. And I've filtered for Resource Hub, which we know all about. These are our subject matter experts in the area of community philanthropy. So they're ranked from top to bottom. And we can see that these are the names of all the organizations. So we have quite a few to choose from that might be good candidates for Claudia on her personal board. Now, we start at the top, and the Global Fund is number 1, and there are 26 references to the Global Fund as being their go-to. I go to for community philanthropy challenges or new ideas or information, I go to Global Fund. Now, as fellows, we've already got Global Fund. In fact, that is sort of the essence of what's happening here, and it's kind of the essence of every day of the Global Fund. But after that, who else might be a good candidate? So we see that KCDF and folks there would be interesting candidates. ZGF would be good candidates. Not so much the Mott Foundation because it's not so accessible, although we do note that that's interesting. People still see the funder because the expertise in funding this space is often sort of translated to the resource giver rather than the resource receiver, is what's happening here. So we honor the Mott Foundation, but we must be clear that that sometimes expertise is displaced by those that have the resources. So we'll skip them for now with a thank you and move over to APN as also a possible. Now, CAF Russia, depending on the context of what you're looking for, Claudia, might matter. TEWA also could be an awesome choice. You might be in West Africa and want to actually have a regional, maybe a Star Ghana would be an awesome possible candidate. So we're seeing all sorts of possible candidates for Claudia here. Let's take a look at, I'm going to look at Star Ghana. You can actually click here. And when I do that, I clicked on Star Ghana, and now I'm seeing Star Ghana here. And I'm actually looking at the sphere. I'm looking at the sphere of influence for Star Ghana. And this is the group of organizations that are associated with Star Ghana. So we've got WAXI. We've got Vildegansen, the international partner on some of the work. We've got APN relationships, get some other international organizations. This might give Claudia a sense of where they're reaching, who they're collaborating with. We can see them also here physically on the map with their tie back to the Global Fund right here. That was a possibility. Let's explore let's explore another option. I'm going to go back here, hide metric, and clear the filter. And we're going to look at one other option. Back to community philanthropy. We're going to show our metric table. And let's choose, I think we're going to choose next time the APN. Okay. And here we have, so we see Sargana in their orbit. We see a slightly broader set of groups, maybe a little bit more expanded. So that Claudia might decide that that perhaps someone at APN or someone at STAR is better suited for them, or might be able to find someone that is connected, easier to connect with. Let's do something that we hadn't planned just really quickly. And look, since Claudia represents Root Change as a senior leader, let's find Root Change on the map. I'm going to go to the search for an actor table. Oops. And I'm going to find Root Change, which is in the dropdown, and click here. And I just found Root Change here in the map. Okay. So there's Root Change, and then we have a system of relationships. Let's go and take a look. So let's see if we see ZGF or STAR in our group. So I'm going to start from down here. And I'm seeing a lot of our fellow organizations, which is great. Actually, I'm not seeing Sargana in here. Let's see if we have we do have ZGF. So maybe actually for this example, Claudia, Sargana would represent a new perspective and a new relationship
Yes.
and partnership.
I really think Sargana would be an appropriate lead to play this role on my board. Yeah,
Awesome.
I'd like to explore with them.
Great, that worked really well. Awesome. Should we try one more, Angela? What would be what might be one that would be what is a role that you're looking for that might be important for you?
Yeah, so I'm personally very interested in MEL and alternative ways to measurement. Like you mentioned earlier, Evan, measuring what matters, within the Shift the Power movement and community. So I would love to have someone who's an expert on that.
Okay, super. So once again, we start with the filter by collaboration area, and we scan down, and so we have all sorts of interesting stuff. We have community philanthropy, diversity, equity, inclusion. Could have a relevant role, but not quite a hit. Here we go, evidence for change. So that's our collaboration area around more of a radical rethinking of how we measure change. And we can look at that. Let's just make sure again that there's nothing else that is important. Perhaps you'd want to look at positive narratives. There is an association with MEL and narratives and storytelling. Yeah, there are a couple here that could be really interesting to explore. But I think, Angela, let's go for the low-hanging fruit, evidence for change. So I just clicked on that, and now same thing. So we've filtered away everything, and we're just looking at the collaboration area focused on evidence for change. And right away, we're seeing really different system than we saw a few minutes ago with community philanthropy, which is interesting to note. We've got this sort of island out here disconnected. I'm just curious. So this is interesting. It's the movement for community-led development. And we're seeing an important piece of the Shift the Power movement, but something a little bit different and not fully integrated. So we'll come back to that. That's not your job right now, looking for a personal board member. Just trying to get a sense of what's going on here in the map. We actually have quite a bit of this sort of isolation. The START network is also somewhat isolated in this group. Feedback Labs is here. Indiana University again. And I knew we were going to get the Global Fund here. That's our center. So let's take a look at the show metric table up here on the right, and you'll click that. And here's who is in this system. So let's think about a group and sort of a perspective that would be helpful. Let's explore this a little bit. So probably not thinking so much around funders. What would, and perhaps, I mean, perhaps you want an international NGO kind of perspective. I would think not, since you're working for one. So you might want, feedback labs would maybe give you, a feedback perspective. That's interesting. We could look at, a university perspective, Indian University, School of Philanthropy. What else might we try? So one troubling observation here is this is a space that is very dominated by international organizations. So I think I'm going to leave it to you, Angela. What dimensions have you seen here? Anyone that sort of attracts you? We can kind of explore a little bit.
Yeah, I think something that would be interesting would be to get a university perspective, like a more, let's just call it like research or academic focus on it. I'd love to learn more about that.
Okay, cool. So I'm just going down to see. There are very few, but a few. Sargana is identified, but not as a resource hub. So they're present, but not as much as we'd like to see. And there are a few others. But let's go with we're going to go with Indiana. Let's see what happens. There's 2 references to them as a resource hub. And here is their system of collaboration. So if you're looking for someone that's very well connected, that has connections to both local organizations and international organizations, we get the Lynn Center here, which I think could be really, really rich. We've got connections to PRIA, which is intriguing. We've got we've got global giving, which is intriguing in terms of democratizing giving. So that's a whole other way of thinking about measurement. This could be quite interesting. So we might be reaching out then to someone at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy for you. And let's go now quickly and see if we have a connection with them. So I'm going to clear my filter. I'm going to put in route change again. And let's see again if we have anyone at Indiana. So I'm going to go to the right, show metric table, and let's see. Okay, I don't see them on our list. So I know that we actually have gone to them once or twice and met up. But I think this is low-hanging fruit again. We ought to be doing more with them, and you would be a great ambassador. So that serves the organizational need. And on your own personal board, I can recommend 1 or 2 outstanding thinkers there that would be absolutely awesome, and a bibliography that would be really get you going. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and I also see, sorry, just here on our list, for example, Feedback Labs, who was also on their list. So yeah, I could also kind of make that connection through someone that we already know, and I know that they also know.
Great. Okay, that's awesome. I love that. We can look at that. So here we are. Let's actually find Feedback Labs here. Oops. Okay, here they are. So this is Feedback Labs, and you're right. We have a direct connection with Feedback Labs right here. So let's go to Feedback Labs for the introduction. And they can, we have our friends at Feedback Labs for sure, including former employees. They can make an introduction via email and introduce you to a wonderful colleague.
Great, thank you.
Okay, great. So that's really a brilliant example of using Pando to support the growing out of your own personal board. Let's take a quick pause. Okay, our next tip is to meet a champion networker in the Shift the Power movement. So the idea here is that there are folks that are just really, really effective in the networking strategies. You know, they've got these activities, strategies, tactics, a way of thinking that is extremely effective in networking their own organization and often individuals within the organization itself. And many of us actually really struggle with this. We'd much rather be, you know, concentrating on some kind of design or working, you know, in a community, you know, without, you know, sort of the noise of reaching out into new scary places and new faces that we don't already know. So that comes down to like a DNA that's deeply embedded in us as individuals. And organizations actually are representative of our you know, of our internal habits as people. So what can we do to sort of break out a little bit? And one of the recommendations we have for this tip number 2 is to identify a champion networker, someone that is already clearly elite as an organization / their team at reaching out and doing this work. So we start with the question, who in the Pathways to Power map is most like your organization and is in the top 10 position as a resource hub, networker, and or as an ambassador broker? So what we're interested in here is someone in particular who's actually an active networker. And we're not actually going to just look at the top. You know, this is not the art of going to Pando and looking to see who's number 1. We want someone who is a lot like our organization. So if we're a community foundation, I want to find another community foundation that's an active networker. If I am a grassroots organization working on social change in my city, I want to find an organization that looks like mine. If I'm working on, let's say, closing spaces in civil society and protecting civil society, if I'm an activist organization doing human rights, I want to find an active networker doing human rights. So that's step 1 to think about is who is like you, who might be like you. And then what we're going to do is we're going to begin to ask the question, how would you describe the networking style of this organization? So we're going to jump in, we're going to look at the pattern of their relationships and see what we can learn from their model behaviors. Next, we ask the question, how might you make a connection and build a relationship with that champion networker? So not only are we trying to like look over the shoulder of that champion using Pando, but we're saying make the authentic connection. So we're going to learn, and then we're learning enough to say, I really admire the way you're connecting. I'm a lot like you. I actually know you from the Shift the Power movement, most likely, or I'd love to introduce myself. Perhaps you don't know me yet. So let's take a jump to Pando and explore this. Again, the questions are here on the screen, and I'm going to jump into Pando. And here again, we are in Pando. And now we're looking for a partner that is in the movement, but is really representing really powerful networking behaviors. So let me just start by introducing you or reintroducing you to by size actor types. That's here on the left. And right now, all of the actor types are listed as all the same. So the dots are all the same sizes. These are the organizations. And you'll recognize this list from our conversations earlier. We have resource hubs, active networkers, brokers or ambassadors. We even have something else we didn't talk about, which are influencers, which tell us about who's an influencer by way of who's most connected to others that are well connected. We're going to focus on this question of that active networker for this tip, right? Because we're looking for a champion networker. And when we do that, we see that Pando gives us larger dots to represent the size of their, so the aggregate like degree that they reach out and connect. So let's just do a little scan to start. So here we have GDSIL, which is a private foundation. We have Global Fund. We have Charles Mott. We have KCDF, Civicus, APN, ZGF. Okay, interesting. And there are others as well. You can have some fun with this yourself. I'm going to go to our handy dandy show metric table to get more information about this group. So now what you'll notice here is I put the I put the show metric table open here to show who's in the system. Before it represented the resource hubs in the right column. Now, because I chose active networker here on the left, it's showing the active networkers here. So here, ranked from top to bottom, are the most active networkers in our system. And this is really interesting. So here we go again, and we're looking at these numbers actually indicate the number of times that they're reaching out. So for example, Humanity United is reporting 32 relationships. Global Fund is reporting 57 relationships. Dahlia is reporting 23 relationships, etc. So this is our peek into active networkers. Let me ask Angela, what would be an example of an organization that might be like, let's say we're going to do a community foundation. Let's say you're representing a community foundation. What might be an organization we would explore as an active networker, given this list up here?
So I'm actually noticing that Comunalia is on there. Scrolling down to the 23.
Nice.
And I'm personally interested in them because they're from Mexico, where I'm based. And I know that they're a great community philanthropy foundation.
Brilliant. Okay, great. So we're gonna click on Comunalia, and I'm gonna hide the metric table just so we can visualize them for a moment. And they're down here. Can we all see that? So this is
Yes.
Comunalia, and here are their many relationships. And if we blow in a little bit, we'll see arrows going out and arrows coming in, which is great. Let's take a look here and go back and see what kind of connections that they have. So one thing that we're seeing is we're seeing many relationships at a sort of unique bubble. So what do we have here? We have, do you know any of the, I'm curious, Angela, if you recognize some of these? Unit OSC?
No, I don't think so.
Fundación Merced, I don't have Spanish, I have French. Cortaro, Fundación again, Punta, FEAC. So a whole quite a rich set of relationships that have been identified. So so we're seeing a little bit of what we said at the beginning about the study that we learned, that having a lot of intimate ties and exclusive ties can be quite powerful. So that's interesting. That's nice to see. Let's also look at this group. What you see here is this group, Comunalia, is linked to this group, and this group actually has its own set of relationships. So what I'm seeing here is an interesting cluster of engagement. We have a relationship here to Landa, and they have their own unique ties, and these guys are bridges to one another. Let me see if those are reciprocal ties. Okay, interesting. So this is a one-way tie, but that could easily, this would be a powerful group. If these two groups enhance their reciprocal relationships, they'd be merging groups together. And they already have some commonalities together, but they primarily have very different systems. This is also sort of the third piece of this. Let's see who's here. That's Charles Mott. Okay, interesting. So just from the Pando map, what I'm going to guess here is that this entire orbit of relationships is at some point a collaborative network that has been fostered and grown because of funding from the Charles Mott Foundation. So there's plenty of opportunities here. So what are we seeing in this cluster? This is probably largely an ecosystem that has a shared funding history through a foundation. It shows a pattern of connections with local groups. It has the potential to connect with others with language affinities. And I'm not necessarily seeing perfect or let's say model networking behavior, because I'm not seeing connections necessarily back to the broader system. Let's scan back a little bit. Okay, so here we are a little bit. We're looking at this. So they're kind of edge actors, and that could be really interesting actually for you, Angela, because Mexico isn't deeply, there's something, we don't have Latin-speaking and Mexico-based entities in the center of our Shift the Power movement yet. So in some ways, you have identified the organization that is the center of the Spanish-speaking ecosystem. So I think it's a good selection. This is a little peek at what they're doing. And what is it that they're doing? To repeat, they have some ties back to the core group. Not that they're ideal, but they're actually the best that we see. They've got their relationship with local actors, and they've got ties to others that are active networkers. I'm just going to do something that I shouldn't do. I'm going to click on influencers for a moment. Okay, so they aren't necessarily, we're just got a quick metric to see if they're connected to other connected people, well-connected people, and they aren't necessarily super well-connected to other well-connected folks. So I think there's a lot of upside in emulating that. There's also things that you should know that maybe won't be exactly everything that you're looking for to emulate. But I think an introduction here would be great and a great start. There might be other groups that don't have language affinity that are better connected. I'm going to quickly peek. I've got influencers on the filter, and I'm going to, first I'm going to clear my map filters. I'm going to click on influencers. I'm going to show metric table. And I just want to see if there are any other community foundations that are influencers. So you've got some other candidates if you wanted to go outside of language affinity, KCDF, WACC, ZGF. WACC is a slightly different entity, but these two for community foundations would be really interesting. There's something to learn probably from WACC's knowledge dissemination, really a model in networking. So there are other candidates. And sadly, we don't see Communalia on this list. But again, it's a list of center preferential attachment sort of entities. This Shift the Power movement is still primarily Africa centric in many ways. So it's not a bad pick. It's a powerful pick. And that's how a perfect example of how we pick and choose and explore using Pando for tip number 2. So I think we'll pause there and move on to tip number 3. Okay, our third tip is to choose a community of practice and make a splash. And as I said at the introduction, this is about being present and being a force in a learning community that is specifically related to advancing the Shift to Power agenda. And as we know, we have 12 collaboration areas. So most likely one of the areas that you want to get involved in is already part of the Pathways to Power map. So the first question we want you to think about is in which of the 12 Pathways to Power communities are you most ready to make an impression. The second question is, who are the key actors in that community, and how does that community compare to others? Can you identify one strength of that community and a challenge? So when we look at the collaboration area, what's going on in it? Is it isolated? Is it rich and cohesive? Is there reciprocal ties? We'll take a look at that. And what we want you to think about is, what can you bring to this community of practice, if you haven't been involved in it already, that would really bring something value adding, something new and important, and something different from what's already there. So let's take a look at Pando and see how this can support us in our approach to making a splash in a community of practice. So we are clearing our filters, and here's our Pathways to Power map. And we're going to use an example. Let's see. So let's say we want to take a look at, let's go for positive narratives. So in the area of positive narratives, I know there are a couple fellows that are really deeply embedded in this space. They may or may not be really involved in leading conversations or participating in existing communities of practice around positive narratives. Let's take a look and see what's happening here. So I'm clicking on positive narratives in the collaboration area, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And I hope you can see this is kind of a light area of collaboration. If you remember back to our tip, our first thing was to kind of look over this collaboration area and see what's happening in it. So what we have here is a number of isolated clusters and organizations. So we have sort of one-off conversations. Here we have our friends from Communalia. Here we have a conversation through Empower to a couple other groups. Here's a group called International Resource for Impact and Storytelling, IRIS. What a shame it's not connected to anyone else but this organization. Here we have the Bugwave Trust with a conversation with Team for Young People, etc. So there's a number of sort of isolates. Here's another one. Here's a group, Itombongo Water Resources Users Association, all thinking about positive narratives. And then we have some centralized kind of clusters. Remember that the colors tell us about who's hanging out with who. So we've got some greens that seem to be kind of hanging out. We've got some blues, a dark blue and a lighter blue. That means there's more relationship than among others. It looks like the greens seem to be quite involved, spirit and action. Here's Jennifer, one of our friends in the Shift the Power movement. APN is here as well. So what can we say about this community in general? One, there's not a lot of cohesion. Two, there are a lot of isolated islands of conversation. So the conversation hasn't come together. We don't see the connection around and momentum around shared exchange. We're kind of at interest level, but not community of practice. Again, this is all based on map data, not necessarily your real life worlds in your specific contexts. But at a global level, what we're seeing is probably at least half right, is that we have interest, high levels of interest, not high levels of cohesion and collaboration around positive narratives. So we have some challenges. There's another thing as well, which is different. We don't even have preferential attachment yet. Let's take a look and see who are the resource hubs in this area. I'm going to go to Resource Hub on my filter and then over to Show Metric Table, and it's showing my resource hubs. And I see the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, 1,000 Currents, APN. So there are a number here, but there are very few references. So After Alliance magazine that has 7 nominations, and Healing Solidarity with Jennifer #3 as well. There really is very few points of contact. So we don't even have attachment yet. We don't have a central conversation. So I would say to make a splash in this space, you're wide open. We don't have, you could play an integrator role. And so your function could be to begin to bring people together and to work with the Pando list to reach out and say, we're having these conversations, let's bring them together. So you can really be a pioneer in this community practice. You might choose to be a content specialist in your language area or your geographic area. You might choose to be a connector across some of the groups that are on the periphery and connecting those up and seeing if there's some common affinity issues. You might decide that there's a specific content area within powers and narratives that might be a spark that would move things forward. So that's how we might think about using the Pando data around collaboration areas to think about what you want to do to really make a splash. Now, going back to our tip slide, one of the things we want you to think about when you do this is how much time and energy do you have to put into this? And if you're going to make a splash, what you need to think hard about is what are the areas where you're ready to contribute, whether it be connecting up the dots, being the honeypot where you want to attract people together, or bringing fresh ideas. Are you willing, to put in a couple hours of work each week to nurture that community? And that's how you would move forward in really making a splash in a community practice. Very much short of that is going to be really difficult to do. So that's our third tip. We'll stop there for a bit. Okay, so we're going to take a look at our fourth tip for increasing your sphere of influence. And that is coming, again, as I mentioned earlier, from our research that indicated that the way that the power of relationships is really under appreciated, and that actually we're operating in environments that actually almost control our destiny, but for our relationships and connections. And that's how powerful I want to reinforce your relationships and connections are in moving you forward and actually ultimately advancing the shift to power agenda. And again, this came from our learning that if you're in a low HDI country, but you have relationships and connections of a certain sort, a certain nature, you can outperform your HDI destiny. And the way to do that, again, is embedded in tips 4 and 5. And that is, first, to build connections, two-way ties with international organizations, not 15, but a few smart relationships, and have intense ties with local organizations. That's our tips 4 and 5. So how might we use Pando to support that? First of all, ask the question, who are your most important international partners and why? What do they do that helps you meet your goals and support your mission? Okay. Sometimes funders are extremely aligned with your mission. Sometimes they're a little less aligned and they're shorter term. So look at that a little bit. What kinds of funders do your peer colleagues have? Do you aspire to have relationships with some of them? Why? What do they provide? What are you hearing that they provide that the international relationships that you have don't already have? Are there different geographies? For example, as I look at it, am I kind of biased towards US relationships, European relationships, African-focused international relationships? How might I diversify that? Would that be of value? Secondly, as you examine that, what's missing from the pattern of your relationships with international actors? And who else might be positioned to better support your specific needs? Let's see if we can locate them on the Pathways to Power map. I'm going to jump off again. And let's see, go back to Pando. Great. And now we're here again on the sidebar on the left. And rather than starting with the collaboration area this time, or the actor type, I'm actually going to go down here And we're going to look at this. It says filter by local actor. And when I do that, I get two options. I have local/national and international. And what we're trying to do here is filter for the nature of the organization. This is one way that we see if the shift to power movement is bubbling up from the grassroots or if it's still dominated by international voices. Our data on this is mixed because the fact that we only have 100 plus organizations that are fully mapped and filled out their profile means that the other 500 or so organizations aren't identified in the filter as being either local or international. Now, honestly, we probably could map that ourselves. We could sit down and tag them. But one of the powerful things about Pando is that it's a mapping for the people by the people. So we're really hoping that people step up and engage. And in some ways, that is sort of the call to fellows, is to, as you go forward in the fellowship, but also into the future, is to remember that we are building a common good here. And so the more we get folks to map on Pando, the more we can answer these difficult questions about equity, voice, and the degree to which relationships are controlled and the conversations are still controlled by international organizations. So with that disclaimer about our data so far, let's click on local and national. And what we're now seeing is the local actors that we've identified in the map. And I'm going to use the show metrics table to see who they are. So we'll recognize them. I think there's something like 50, 30 to 50, I can't recall exactly. And here they are. And in terms of resource hubs, we've got them now. That's our default. So these are all the local organizations ranked from most seen as resource hubs to less referenced. Okay. So that's a sense of where they sit. Now let's go back and take a look at just the international. So get an impression of this system. Go here and see. So the Global Fund is still referenced here because I'm not filtering it out because people don't go to it. So it's a relationship identified by a local organization. Let's go now to international. And we'll see again, we see the intense difference in the ties. So that's a way for us to flip back and forth and to look at this system from the vantage point of just local or just international. And again, if we wanted to do all organizations, we could do that too here. So let's take a look at KCDF, which is a really good example of a group that is living the principle that we described of having 3 to 4 key ties with international agencies, and the 5th tip, which is to have rich connections of local actors. So I'm going to put KCDF here in the search for an actor. Oops. And my drop down brings it right up. I'm going to click on that. And here we see, I'll just center it a little bit. Here's KCDF. We'll zoom out. Got a connection down here. And we've got here the group. Let me just check one thing here. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to open up the show metric table and just take a look at this world. Here we have for KCDF. So it's quite a big system. Let's take a look at the degree to which some of these are international organizations. So here's one tie. This tie has lots of other connections. So it's a tie to others with many other connections. And that group is Charles Stewart Mott. So that's one example. Excellent. And let's take a look here at this group. That's a tie to Wildgunsen, so another international agency. And I'm sure this is our friends at Global Fund. So here we see kind of an example of the 3 organizations. I think Global Fund is kind of a hybrid international global, less of a perfect example, but we're seeing examples of the 3 to 4 strategic ties back to the organization. And as we look closer, we're also seeing the identification of local organizations here, and here that are all part of that 5th tip of having deep ties in your own community. So they seem to be a really good example of meeting the two rules for networking your way out of a low HDI situation. 2.5 rules, I'm going to say. And then to repeat it one more time, it's 3 to 4 strategic ties with international organizations, and it's deep ties with local actors. And if you can, exclusive ties with groups that aren't typically part of the system. You're in it. It gives you the power of being a social sort of connector of new groups. And when you bring new groups into the system, you do two things. One is you're building the commons. You're doing good for the movement, and you're also demonstrating to others that you have a unique power to introduce others to the system, and that actually enhances your own social capital and your own brand identity. So those are very quickly a little bit of a way that you can see where you fit on this idea of tip number 4, international connections, and 5, relationships. What will you do as you look at this yourself? What I challenge you to do is go to the Pando map and put in your own organization. Put it in, put in your fellows organization for yourself, and do an assessment. Where do you fit? Do you see yourself with the proper ties that you'd like to see? Who might you be able to connect with that would begin to build out your international ties? And how are you doing on this question of building deep relationships and connections with others? And how might you bring them into the Pando map so that we can benefit as we build a commons? Great, thanks so much.